Is it time to dismantle some doctrines? If you don't know what that means, then come along with me. I'm Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Bible college teacher and pastor of more than 20 years. Join me as we deconstruct whatever dogmas and beliefs have held you behind, and together work to reconstruct and rebuild your authentic self. Hey everybody, welcome back to the first episode of the Dismantling Doctrine Podcast for 2025. I am your host, as always, Dr. Clint Haycock. Looking forward to another fantastic year, putting out some really good content. And in fact, speaking of great content, I'm really excited to bring this first episode, which I am calling Holy Terror Classic Edition, catching up with Conway and Siegelman, a MindShift sequel. They actually said, can we do a MindShift sequel? Even though I've changed the name of the show last year, they still remember it as the MindShift podcast, so we're going to throw that in there for them. But I'm just going to let this episode run. That's why I'm putting this introduction at the beginning, kind of going back to the old format of the show for this first episode. This is a really wide-ranging discussion. I caught up with them late December before the Christmas break. I've been waiting really eagerly to get this out in early January. Now that the Trump administration is going to be taken over in the month of January, what in the world is going to happen? Everyone's waiting with bated breath to see just how much influence things like Project 2025, how much influence the Christian right, the new apostolic reformation is going to have in the new Trump administration. I've been saying it since probably July or August of 2024. I warned everybody as much as I could that Project 2025 hasn't gone away. And now we're going to see come the end of January when Trump is inaugurated, are they going to enact a lot of these draconian policies? This is sort of the last gasp of Christian nationalism, the Christian right trying to get its way. So I don't know what we're going to be in for, but I feel very fortunate that I'm over here in the United Kingdom. To be quite honest, I'm an expat. America, love it or leave it, they can have it. So let's hear what Conway and Siegelman have to say. But before we get into that, I'm going to tell you what's coming up here in the next episode or two. I've got a conversation that I had with Tim Mills, the harmonic atheist. I was on his show a while back. If you haven't caught that conversation, check him out on his YouTube channel. We talked about my book that came out in September. It's called Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, How Bill Gothard, Church and Family Taught Me Christianity Doesn't Work. This book, if you haven't read it yet, it's a fantastic read. Even though I do say so myself, I wrote it. Everyone says it's super readable, a great story of my growing up in fundamentalist kind of cult-like Christianity under the teachings of Bill Gothard. My parents were heavily invested in that, heavily invested in the church in the Seattle, Washington area. And it talks about how I became a Christian, lived a good Christian life, and then walked away from it all. I don't want to do too many spoilers in there, but this book is a good New Year's resolution. If you want to hear about my story growing up, you can find it exclusively on Amazon as a paperback or a Kindle version, the ebook version. The good thing about the Kindle book version is if you buy that one for just a little bit more, you can get the virtual voice audible version as well, just for a little bit more. And that's a really good read considering it was done by AI. It's phenomenally well read. So I am working on hopefully this year doing my own reading of the book if I get some time. It's really busy with work, but that was one of my goals. Maybe it's a New Year's resolution for 2025 to do that reading of the book. The other thing too is I'm going to be doing probably in the month of February, I'm going to be doing another chapter reading from the book. So if you haven't bought the book yet, look forward to hearing another chapter. Maybe that'll spur you to go out and pick up your own copy of Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People. I'll just say too, before we get into the conversation with Conway and Siegelman, if you want to make another New Year's resolution, you can decide to support the Dismantling Doctrine Podcast on Patreon. The links to that are in the show notes. You get access to our great DDP Zoom calls. And in fact, speaking of which, we're going to be having one coming up at the end of January. I've got Lauren Axelrod. She's going to be coming in on the 26th of January at 8 p.m. UK time. You can connect with Lauren. This is a great benefit that you get for being a Patreon supporter of the show. You can connect with former guests, and I'm working on getting somebody in the month of February, possibly Tim Mills. We're not sure yet, but I will let you know who's coming up in the month of February for our DDP Zoom call. Just a great benefit for being a Patreon supporter of the show. All right, let's get on into this conversation with my good friends, Flo Conway and Jim Siegelman, looking at Holy Terror Classic Edition, catching up with Conway and Siegelman, a MindShift sequel. I am so happy to be catching up with longtime good friends, Conway and Siegelman. Welcome back to the Dismantling Doctrine Podcast.
It's been a couple of years. It's great to be back with you, Clint.
Good.
It's
It's good to see you.
Oh man, it's been so long. And in fact, yeah, we changed the name of the show. We went round and round about that. But yes, or we might call this a MindShift sequel, even though that was the old name of the podcast. So we'll have to see what the title ends up being. But you've been busy. Obviously, you've been in Greece in the summertime doing some writing. Tell us what's happening because we talked a couple of years ago. You were thinking about doing a Holy Terror sort of update. What's happening with Holy Terror?
Well, because of the responses we've had over the years, people wanting us to bring back the original in a more let's say fastidious way, because they wanted our perspective, because the perspective is an information age perspective on everything that we talk about in Holy Terror and the new concepts we bring to it, like ideological fundamentalism. It's a new concept to be able to understand what has happened over these 40 years to people in this movement that started out as the religious right. And so that's what we've been doing. We've been doing that, getting that ready to go, and it's finally out. It's available everywhere.
We just put out what we call the classic edition of Holy Terror. The book first came out in 1982, and we last updated it in 1984 to deal with the first half of the Reagan years. We put out our model then, and it was in real time. We were tracking the rise of the religious right as it was happening, as they made their first moves into Washington with the Reagan landslide of 1980, for which the so-called religious right leaders, Jerry Falwell, moral majority people, the new right theorists and strategists, claimed a lion's share of the credit. And statistically, you look at the exit polls, they had a lot to do with the Reagan landslide then.
But Reagan, it's like, this is something that I don't think people knew then or took seriously. And it's important to look now at this, because there's a lot of things now that will open up and give a little bit of a room of understanding of what we are looking at now in the United States in relation to this last election and what's happening there. Because Ronald Reagan was really the focal point. Okay, he was an actor, he was whatever, but he was in there, absolutely. And he was the one who was giving a lot of the power and control over to people then. So that's important in Holy Terror to look at that.
In hindsight, Reagan and really every presidential and even Republican administration up until Donald Trump, they did still have some respect for the institutions of American government. They were bending the rules, but not breaking them, as they say. They played around with this. They did breach the wall of separation between church and state, the foundation wall of American society and culture. But they weren't able to break it. There was still enough opposition. There were still enough mainstream Republicans in the 80s to be a guardrail and a check and balance on that. But what we were watching from the beginning, as you know, Clint, Holy Terror grew out of our first book, Snapping, which was research into the religious cults and therapies of the 1970s and leading right up to the Jonestown Massacre in 1978. And in that time, we traveled the country back and forth and talked to hundreds of people who had been in and come out of the cults. And we were interested in how they had gone under, what their experience was in the group, and how they managed to separate. We were talking mostly to ex-cult members at that time. And we say in the preface, Woodward and Bernstein, when they were doing the Watergate investigation, said they were told, follow the money. Our principle has always been follow the messages. We're looking at the communication, whether it's writing, whether it's person to person, mass media, nonverbal. And that's what we learned and set down first in Snapping. And then in the late 70s, after we published Snapping, we were traveling the country, speaking dates and teaching in colleges, universities, and all the reports coming to us, all the concerns suddenly shifted in the late 70s from these esoteric cults like the Moonies and the Hare Krishna and Scientology to variations on the theme of evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity.
Sort of we did the first large-scale North American study on the cult phenomenon. And
We've got sirens here.
We've got sirens. They're not coming for you, are they?
Welcome to New York. Not yet, I hope.
Welcome to New
It sounds
York.
like holy terror going on outside your window.
Believe me, it feels like it sometimes.
And they're
day.
demolishing a church behind you there, but you said the workers knocked off, so that's
They're
another
knocked
topic.
They're taking it down brick by brick with jackhammers, which I think is the new Trump administration's policy too.
Yeah, could be. Anyway, you were saying, Flo.
Yes, the cult members. Let's see.
We did the first study back in the late
right.
70s and early 80s of the long-term effects of the cult experience. And what we found, just as this shift was happening, was that out of 48 cults and therapies in the US and Canada that were included in our study, 30 of them, more than 2/3, came out of evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity. And as a group, when we did the numbers and from all the responses we had, as a group,
The after effects
of more than 20 different physical, mental, and emotional long-term after effects people experience was more severe, long-lasting for people in the so-called Bible cults of that era than any other cult except Scientology, which we won't go into now. They were much more damaging. But Moonies, Krishnas, all the others, Eastern cults, whatever, it was the Bible cults that were so damaging. And we'll talk later about how that has progressed and what we've been researching since then.
Yeah, this is a very timely discussion, obviously, because we're just, when we're doing this recording now, I mean, Donald Trump has just been named president again just a few days ago, according to what we have on our timeline. So the people that are around him, I mean, can you draw a through line from the people that were around Ronald Reagan to the Evangelical Advisory Board of Donald Trump? Because I just had a conversation the other week with Matthew Taylor, and he's got a really interesting book called The Violent Take It by Force, and he's lifted the lid on these new apostolic Reformation characters. And these are the new people that are around Trump. You know, guys like Jerry Falwell, they're a distant shadow of people like Paula White and, Lance Wallnau and Dutch Sheets and people that were, egging the crowds on January 6th and all the rest of it. I mean, what's happened since Holy Terror? I mean, you were on the ground in the late 70s, early 80s. What's the through line to Donald Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board?
Well, the one thing I will say is that in snapping and with our study, we saw when people were in for a very long period of times, we're doing the practices, and you have to say now, people who now physically, because they're behaviorally part of everything, part of the ideology, part of everything, and that the people who were in so much, who did all of the rituals, who were in it, and over time, people became unable to function. And it's like, that's where we came up with a new concept of information disease. Because that's, and it's like they were, what were some of the symptoms?
Well, the main symptoms that were cognitive symptoms of people in direct proportion to how much time they spent every week in what we call ritual and study time. In the Bible sects, it was obviously, it was Bible study, scripture memorization, it was group sermons, it was speaking in tongues, it was all the charismatic practices. And the numbers at that time were from 20 to 40 hours a week people spent in those practices in the groups. And so much more was private Bible study time, and some of the practices that we documented back then from Campus Crusade for Christ and the Navigators and even InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, the big campus missionary groups that were active worldwide, were the ones that were counseling people to do this kind of Bible study and scripture memorization around the clock, to memorize verses before they went to sleep, so they would be going around in their heads at night, and to speak in tongues much, as they said in the Way International, which meant all the time. And people,
Praying in tongues.
when they came out of these groups, they couldn't stop. It took them 1.5 to 2 years at that time to just begin to regain control over their thinking processes, their emotions, their ability to make reasoned, independent choices.
Or get rid of the chance. And there was one girl from a fundamentalist group that she just had this repetition going on in her mind. She could not stop it. And it takes a couple of years for people to just even get rid of that.
So that's what we saw then with the turn from the 70s into the 80s. And you're absolutely right. By today's standards, Jerry Falwell, even Pat Robertson, little Jim Baker.
Could they get in the door?
they were kind of just the beginning, the light entertainment. We called them the newcomers back then. But this has progressed, and in the new preface to the new edition, we kind of begin to track this turn from the old timers to the newcomers and the televangelists who went up in flames with the PTL scandal. And the winner who came through that was Pat Robertson and CBN, and his own run for president in 1988 flamed out. But what came from that was the Christian Coalition, his group, and his protege, Ralph Reed, who to this day is still leading what he calls the Faith and Freedom Coalition. That has been a major player in the Get Out the Vote effort, that the media here in the US aren't really talking about it too much. They have so many more safe things to talk about: the Latino vote, the male versus female vote, the gender gap, the racial gaps. But it's always been our experience with the mainstream media in the US. We call it the lightning bolt effect. They do not really want to get into religion. It makes them uncomfortable. And they're always open to the charge that began back in the 70s and 80s, that they're atheists and that they are religious. They're persecuting people for their religious beliefs. And most of our colleagues in the media don't really know how to deal with that, so they would prefer to talk about anything else. But from then to now, we watched the progression from Moral Majority to Christian Coalition, and came the Dominionists and the Charismatics and the New Apostolic Reformation group. And they're now in the driver's seat of the new Trump administration.
And that's what I realized after talking to Matthew, is that when he explained that it was Trump's meeting with these guys in, what was it, 2014, 2015, when in the run-up to his first presidency at Trump Tower. Paula White Cain was his quote-unquote personal pastoral advisor. Apparently they'd had a long-term relationship of over 20 years where she's been his spiritual advisor in some capacity. So she introduced him to the people that she knew. And these were those, like you say, the New Apostolic Reformation types, these Messianic rabbis and televangelists. And that's the group that became the advisory board to Trump, and the old guard couldn't get in. So now, they're trying to knock on the door. They're the gatekeepers now. So we're seeing a definite shift in this whole story. But I love the fact that you guys were on the ground. One thing I was going to say about snapping, when you were talking about that, when I read snapping, so much of it made sense to me as an ex-evangelical, because it's a way to explain what happened to us in those Bible studies and sermons and worship services and everything. It's actually imprinted on our brains. And it's hard. It makes it so hard to get out, like you say, and to break those things, and explains, I think, so many times why people are triggered when you hear a song, when you hear something that takes you right back to those days. It's so hard to break out of those grooves. It is kind of imprinted on your brain, isn't it?
Well, and in some ways, rather than being imprinted, it's internalized controls.
Yeah.
And it's like that kind of repetition thing that keeps going. That's an internalized control that you've taken in. And that's part of the organic part of communication that people don't understand. How even something like that can be internalized, can control whatever it is that you're doing, or control your mind, control your emotions. And one of the things I wanted to say, though, about the Christian Freedom Coalition now, I think Ralph Reed was at it again. There was something, I think you read it really recently. But one of his descriptions, and this is back in the 80s, I think will describe for everybody how they felt when they woke up on Wednesday morning. And he said, we cover our faces, we paint our faces, We travel at night. And when you don't know, you don't even know it. You're in a body bag. When you wake up, you're in a body bag.
Yeah, that's how
And
ruthless they are.
That was the beginning of the Christian Coalition, which grew out of Robertson and his efforts in the late 80s and early 90s. And he named it as a kind of stealth campaigning. And we were watching all summer with all the different groups and the polling, the advanced polling, and there was not that much attention paid. It's as if they took for granted the role of the Christian right, and which is now morphed into Christian nationalism in terms of their goals, their organizing. And when the exit polls were done, we looked at the numbers. The numbers of evangelical Christians in the electorate have gone down from the low 30% range 40 years ago to 22% this time. But traditional Catholics have gone up a little bit. And then you have the Hispanic vote, which seemed to be credited with making that difference of 5 to 10%. And Hispanic males, more than females, came out for Trump. So you've got this combination of machismo and a lot of people of black, brown, and white who did not really want to let a woman be president, or were against a person of color, let alone both being president. But this male-female split is surprising. And then you look at the organizing. Ralph Reed said it in one of his interviews. We've seen it in other places. The organizing in the Trump campaign, which the Democrats all thought was non-existent on the ground, was all being done again quietly through the churches, and especially through Latino, Hispanic churches. And that probably had a big difference in this election.
It's people voting against their own self-interest, because I saw somebody on X, on Twitter the other day, saying, my Latino neighbor voted for Trump. Now he's worried that his family's going to get deported. I mean,
well,
he said he's going to have the biggest mass deportation in American history on day one. Millions of people. Yeah, so let's vote for this guy. I mean, it's unbelievable. And now we're seeing all these crazy appointments, whether or not they'll actually get, confirmed. I suppose guys like Matt Gaetz and Pete Hegseth and Tulsi Gabbard and some of these other people, they're extremists, a lot of them. They still have to go through the hearing. But like you say, if the Republicans control the House and the Senate, then it's a done deal.
Practically.
Well, and it's also one of the thoughts coming out of the media here is, and it seems very true, that it looks like what is happening, is that what Donald Trump is doing right now, it's really these appointments that are so completely unthinkable. They're outrageous. There's no experience there for justice, for defense, for intelligence services, that he's testing the Republican Party. Because it's a test for his complete control. And that is going to go. If Thune and the senators don't stand their ground in relation to the confirmation process, then the recess appointments will come in, etc. But it is a test, because that's the one thing that Trump, even what Elon Musk is such a funny character in some ways, because it's so clear that this is the richest man in the world, right? Okay. So what is Trump looking at? He's going, nobody is richer than I am. Nobody is better than I am. Nobody is smarter than I am. And God has anointed me. And that's what this whole movement has done. And want to know an internalized control?
A couple of things we noted in this span of 40 years where, in some ways we feel like the grand old men and women of this issue, because we were the first ones. Holy Terror was the first book. First book that did it, and really got a look at what this movement was, how it was building, and actually how it operated, how it controlled people. But from Ronald Reagan through George Bush Jr., it was pretty much along the same lines, staying within the system of government. The guardrails were still holding, and even the evangelical movement was still screaming religious persecution and pushing the pro-life movement and their culture war issues. But when Trump came down that escalator, he did a couple things. First, he ripped the mask off the Christian nationalist movement. They had begun claiming, they had always begun by saying, oh, the Supreme Court decision on school prayer in 1964, that was what started the movement. Oh, it was Roe v. Wade in 1973, that's what started the movement.
It was the thing of...
What Randall Balmer was one of several scholars who made clear, the racist roots of the Christian right were there from the outset. And it was Brown versus Board of Education and rulings in the decade from the 50s.
It was about segregated schools. That's really what it was, wasn't it?
That Bob Jones and Jerry Falwell,
that
was really what ignited them. And they kept that underneath. It was the stealth component. Trump ripped the mask off that and brought out the element of naked race hatred. And not just between blacks and whites, but just between ethnic groups, between all the major religions. And too many of the Christian right now are joining that movement. They're in it, and they make no bones about what their issues are.
Well, I was going to say, before you were talking about information disease and this ideological fundamentalism. How much would you equate that to the classic Trump rally, the cult of Trump? Because I read Jeff Charlotte's book, The Undertow, and it's really a fascinating read. I don't know if you've come across it yet, but he goes on a kind of a cross-country tour, and he interviews a lot of people that are like diehard Trumpists, conspiracy theories, QAnon, and all the rest of it. And he goes to a couple of Trump rallies, and it's fascinating as an outside observer what his impression is, because it's very much like a religious service.
Yes.
You've got this playlist, these songs that they always play the same playlist at every Trump rally. Thousands of people waiting and waiting and waiting. He always keeps them waiting. He's late, and it's this build up. And then the man comes and the plane comes in with the Trump thing on the side and whatever, so it's very much a mystical manipulation, milieu control and all that. So would you relate that to what you were talking about as far as the cultic aspect of what Donald Trump has been able to do?
Well, I think that we have to make a distinction between the kind of cult phenomenon in the 1970s, and that was really that was the first kind of movement where people, it was personal experiences they were looking for. And the people and the groups going after these lambs were fairly large known groups, like the Hare Krishna, like the Moonies, and they had lots of businesses off on the side and everything. But it was the controls and everything were personal in relation to their families, in relation to how they kept them. How they kept them going out fundraising and this, that, and the other thing. It all had to do with that individual person, and that individual person being in their commune or wherever they were. What we saw as distinctly different in this movement away, and what we first saw when we were on the ground for Holy Terror, is that this was now a movement aiming for the heart of our country, a movement aiming for the hearts and minds of all of Americans, and that this was mass communication at the most mass that you could imagine at the time. And our technologies then were not internet, social media, or anything like that.
Not there yet.
We didn't have that kind of global media reach yet. So that what we're looking at now is the way in which this has gone completely into the mass communication, into small groups, large groups.
And global telecommunications now.
Yeah.
But it's quite a distinction has to be made. Lots of people have been talking about the Trump cult and the cult of Trump.
Right.
And when we made a distinction in the 70s, when we testified before the joint Senate House hearings in Washington after Jonestown, we were relative moderates on this subject. It wasn't the living leaders that was that important. It was nothing to do with their beliefs or dogma. What we focused on in all of our work were the messages, and what Flo called the internalization of control. And in every one of the major cult groups of the 70s, there were what we called mind control methods, whether it was chanting, meditation, speaking in tongues in the Bible groups.
Pray.
And those were the things that people were told to do it much. Christians chanted around the clock, 1,700 rounds of Hare Krishna before breakfast. And in the Way International, do it much was all the time. What we also did when we went from snapping to holy terror, what we found, and we coined this term, not mind control, but emotional control. And emotional control worked differently. It was a different form of internalized control. What we talked about then, and we cited Campus Crusade as a good example, where people were instructed, do not depend on feelings. That was the last of the 4 spiritual laws in Bill Bright's little book. As he said, I'll read it to you directly. He said, the train will run with or without the caboose. The caboose was the last of their little toy train in the booklet. He said, the same way as Christians, we do not depend on feelings or emotions. We place our faith, our trust in God and the promises of our word. His word. And what's pretty clear, and what we documented in Campus Crusade, in some of the other groups, they were talking about emotional control techniques for stilling the emotions. And that's what we found with Trump. You go to a Trump rally, they're not chanting, they're not meditating on Donald Trump or even memorizing his scriptures. He doesn't have any.
His art of the deal.
But what Trump has done, the main control he internalizes in what is not a religious cult, it's a cult of personality. It goes back to Hitler, and Mussolini is a very close example from the 20th century. And it's loyalty for Trump. Effectively, when he is finding his inner group right around him, what he demands from everyone, and they all know it, including in the Congress, is loyalty. And what we found in the internalized controls of emotional control, it is these oaths. And the loyalty oaths, explicit or implicit, that Trump demands is how his control is internalized in the people close around him and in so many of his followers. And you see this in the Christian groups, and why fundamentalist Christian groups really laid the template for this is where they tell you, you cannot doubt. Doubt is the devil. The devil is a doubt bringer. And they tell you, where's another example of it? Call doubt sin. The Bible says doubt is sin. And that was the way that people we talked to, and Holy Terror, we had the first evangelicals. Nobody called them that at the time, but we did call them ex-Christians. And they told us how, when they would go out in the world, they literally would see Satan perched on the shoulders of people who were evil, who were the enemy. And they felt, as you know, and all your listeners know, they had internalized the living spirit of Jesus Christ. And they had
spiritual warfare.
Were instructed to surrender the throne of their lives to him.
Well, the other thing that you don't ever hear any distinction made or focus on it. There's the beliefs and the religious ideology and the religious doctrine. But what happened when we were working with Holy Terror, what we see now is that there are people in this movement who now want to take down the secular. They want to get in the secular part of our culture, of our society, of our government, and start taking that apart. And it's that secular part, like right here in the where is it? InterVarsity.
Oh yeah,
right here. InterVarsity. Now that's like Christianity for the open-minded.
That was their booklet.
Okay, these words. This is where the messages are so important. I mean, they proclaimed head and heart, mind and will are all involved in this momentous matter of response to Christ. Our minds are persuaded, our hearts are drawn, our wills are surrendered. I mean, and InterVarsity is not one of your.
They were a moderate evangelical group in the 70s.
But
where are they now?
Why I wanted to read that of InterVarsity is because, well, somebody who came to us here in New York City after Holy Terror was published, she was in InterVarsity for most of her young life and the whole thing. And it has done some really deep damage to her. And she has been trying to get out of and trying to go forward on. And, you know, and she keeps having, you know, she goes back a few steps, forward a few steps, but it was InterVarsity. But it's also the people, besides the Falwells and the Pat Robertsons, on the other side were the people, the architects of what we now have. Paul Weyrich, he was an Eastern Orthodox Catholic, okay? And then you have Terry Dolan, who was gay, and he was a libertarian. And then you have Richard Viguerie, who was he loved machinery and mailing lists. So he was their
direct mail.
Yeah, he was the direct mail king, wasn't he?
Those were the technologies of that time.
That's all they had.
Church, direct mail, and they had what we call it the black marketplace of ideas, because what Viguerie would send out at the touch of a button were millions of junk mail letters to people from Falwell, and he had his own mailing operation, and to all these groups, and they were the ones spreading that disinformation about the senators who they had targeted, about trying to promote all their groups, the pro-life movement, which was found in one of Terry Dolan's focus groups, and in their research, they found that at that time, this huge block of unregistered voters in America, the evangelical Christians who had historically stayed out of politics, could not be moved by economic issues or foreign policy. They found the single issue of abortion was the issue that would get them out, get them registered, and get them to the polls. And they played that for all it's worth. From that day to this, that has been the controlling, emotional control on the Christian right.
Absolutely. Well, look at here's Trump on the campaign trail. I overturned Roe versus Wade. I did it. He said, as a nod to his evangelical support base. I mean, that's what they wanted. As you say, you go back to Holy Terror, and you talk about that in the book. You know, this is the origins of the Christian right, the abortion line, when actually it was segregation academies that were the driving factor. But you know, that debt has been paid in the minds of many evangelical voters, and they're saying, yeah, we support Trump again in 2024 because he's the guy who got it done that nobody else could do. They wanted to overturn Roe versus Wade. I mean, when I was an evangelical, we used to go on Right to Life, marches and all these kind of things around Portland and Seattle and different places, praying in the streets, oh God, someday, overturn Roe. I was part of that movement back in the mid 80s.
50 years, and he delivered.
He delivered.
And that, to this day, was the primary emotional control of Trump movement and of his personality cult, of the MAGA movement. It is loyalty to Trump. It is not questioning him. And this is what these groups have internalized. After the first insurrection, and when COVID came down during the pandemic, we got a lot of insight into people in these most marginal fringe groups like the Proud Boys and the QAnon.
The Oath Keepers and all that. Yeah.
Oath Keepers. What you saw, especially in QAnon, the few people did come out after the insurrection when they were prosecuted, and they came to their senses a little bit and realized the state of mind they had fallen into, the rabbit hole they had tumbled down into. What they described, and we were watching this for signs of mental and emotional control. They called it research. There were all these millions of people during COVID locked in their rooms, stuck on their computers, going down that rabbit hole. And again, the two markers we found for information disease, we call intensity and duration. In occult, it's mind control rituals, Bible study, and this kind of hours per week. For QAnon and a lot of these ideological fundamentalists, it is pure intensity and duration, the manner in which they were absorbed in these screens, which, as everyone knows, is one of the most powerful and intimate forms of one-to-one communication and many-to-one communication, and the sheer number of hours they spend.
YouTube. I've had friends. I had a friend that lives up in Liverpool, and he got into conspiracy theories, and he was sending me stuff, and it was all over YouTube, all over, the internet. You've got to check this out. 9/11 was a hoax, and the pandemic and all, and he just got way into it. Like you say, intensity and duration,
Yeah.
those are good markers. Well, I was thinking too, who are you talking about? You talking about, let's say, the garden variety evangelical sitting in a pew in any town, USA, in some church. Is this the type of person you're describing that's going to become, they're going to hear this stuff from their pastor, from social media, from YouTube, everywhere out there following Kenneth Copeland and all these, other kind of people on TV and whatever. What happens to that person that causes them, okay, I'm not just going to vote for Trump. I'm going to go to a Trump rally and I'm going to get way into this, because you were talking, Flo, about basically like taking dominion. That was the language, isn't it? They're the seven mountains mandate. They're going into education, arts, business, media. It's not just about religion anymore. We got to take the seven mountains and take dominion.
But that's yes, but I think that the most important thing, the other side of the religion, is to understand how the secular culture was also attacked. And that's the one thing that you can find in Holy Terror, is a step-by-step understanding of that. When religion and politics came into our government, the way in which these three strategists, Paul Weyrich from the
Heritage Foundation founder.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the Heritage Foundation. We got to get into Project 2025 at some point here.
Just one quick aside, in Holy Terror, we document when Ronald Reagan took office, he was handed a 1,000-page mandate for leadership playbook for how they were supposed to do it, prepared by the ideologues at the Heritage Foundation. So Project 2025 is just Reagan's mandate on steroids.
Yeah, it's a continuation of what they began back in the Reagan era. Only it's way more extreme now.
Yeah, and it's like, if you can see the original, it's like the original base, like over there where the steel beams are showing now on the church. It's like the basic infrastructure of what now has been put over with all kinds of bows and whatever, or meanness or whatever, is Terry Dolan was the one who came up with the attack style campaign. And that is where no holds barred, no morality, no values,
no truth,
nothing. And that is where they tear apart a person's reputation, an incumbent especially, what they've been doing to Biden and what they did to the Biden-Harris.
Liz Cheney, people like her.
Yes, and they tear them apart. I mean, they shred them, and then they send their people in to finish the job and pull the strings on the media or wherever in the social media to get people to say, see, those people are the ones who are the problem. They're the ones causing it. Like so many now saying the Democrats are the ones who hate democracy. The Democrats are it's completely opposite. It's kind of like, what is that?
We're living in bizarro world where
it's a known tactic.
Black is white, white is black.
But to your question, Clint, why the evangelical Christians in America have been such sitting ducks for Trump, especially through this 40-year reign, guided by the one control of the pro-life and anti-abortion movement. But what we documented in Holy Terror, and it goes back to our work in snapping, what happens when people are recruited and converted and undergo one of these life-changing spiritual experiences? They had a name for it in all the different groups. In Scientology, it was going clear. In the Moonies, it was Moon's what was it, his doctrine. And they had practices of centering and chanting and meditation. The thing that we saw was the call to surrender. The call to surrender, William James, in his 1906 book on the varieties of religious experience, cited the call to surrender in the traditional altar calls of First and Second Great Awakening Christian
revivalism.
As that thing that unleashed the great emotional feeling of being born again, or of some form of awakening or enlightenment. What we saw, starting with the cults of the 70s and going right into the fundamentalist groups, the call to surrender was the gateway to control, for internalizing the control. And every one of these groups had a version of it. Bill Bright did it in his book, Jesus and the Intellectual. He said, the secret is surrender, the essence of being born again, surrender of the intellect, the emotions, and the will, the total person. Christ cannot be in control if I am on the throne, so I must surrender the throne of my life to him. When you surrender like that, and your listeners will know it, something fantastic can happen. You can have the most overwhelming burst of a spiritual experience.
It's euphoric.
And what happens in all the groups we've studied is the same. In the aftermath of the moment, why we called it a snapping experience, people will fall down from that great emotional high, and they're in a state of heightened suggestibility. And when people then are led into a group where they're then taught daily, hourly rituals to maintain that altered state, it's an ongoing altered state, which some have likened to a hypnotic trance. And we saw that in the worst cults and in some of the most extreme Christian groups. But we have to contend that when evangelical Christians spend their lives in that state of surrendering the throne of their life, it's a very short hop to surrendering to Donald Trump, to being vulnerable to his suggestions and the commands of the MAGA movement. And we've
gaslighting
time and time again why they can't question, why they can't think critically, why they don't dare to think independently. And these are all the conditions of emotional control, which is Trump's model.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know you have something to say, but this is a really important point I think you're making, Jim, and that is that churches have paved the way for Donald Trump for decades on a lot of levels. Celebrity pastors. One example is someone just said this the other day in our Facebook group, that all these pastors that have had affairs and all sorts of things, a lot of them have been restored to ministry. So we've had these patterns of someone falls from grace and then 6 months later he's back, and he's been restored. It's standing ovations and oh my gosh, this is great and wonderful. Look what the Lord has done. Exactly. Never mind about the victim. Look at Donald Trump. I mean, he's a guy who's a convicted rapist and all this. Hey, so what? Who cares? We've forgiven pastors for years. Why not forgive Donald Trump? So these patterns have been set for decades. As you say, the suggestibility, the release of control. A Trump rally is in many ways similar to a megachurch service. The emotional control and the heightened manipulation of emotions and the music and everything else. You could be in a church service.
Well, and I think that this evolution, of the experience as people go. And I think that's one of the things that Diane in the second chapter in Holy Terror, Slain in the Spirit, why Diane's story is so incredible and so complete.
Yeah, it's very powerful.
Because what she shows is not just where the vulnerabilities are, but when it comes to the point where the church and the movement is saying, you can't care about anybody else. You have to get rid of all your books. You go, burn them. And she couldn't burn her books, so she put them down in her basement. But she said when it came to the point where I couldn't care about anybody anymore. I wasn't supposed to care about another person. She says that's when everything became so dark. And she said, I just went to bed and just wanted to die. She said, and I knew I would die very soon because I couldn't talk to anybody. I couldn't, it was complete.
And Diane, that chapter closes in 1980, April 1980, was the first Washington for Jesus rally. Several 100,000, somewhere between 200 and 400,000 evangelical Christians on the mall in Washington. And she said she went there with her tape recorder. She had come out by then. She went there with her notes and her tape recorder. She said, I tried to talk to all these people and explain what they're doing. They're going to take over the country. This is so political. She says, I couldn't get through to them. She said, not one of them thought that what they were doing was political. They all thought they were there to serve God. And, when you come to the MAGA movement, years ago, when we were researching snapping, in fact, it's in snapping, we interviewed Marjorie Gortner, the child evangelist, the child holy roller.
I've seen the movie.
a miracle child. It's an incredible thing.
Boy preacher.
And we're asking Marjo, how did they do this? How did they speak in tongues and do this thing? He said, you'll never get it with that attitude. But what he said, look, and this was years earlier, but he said, these people don't go to fancy nightclubs and discos. This is their entertainment, to go to church. In the same way, these huge Trump MAGA rallies, what Jeff Charlotte attended and tracked across the country. These are their entertainment, and Trump is the consummate con man and entertainer. He makes them laugh, and they love his insults. And sad to say, when I say he ripped the mask off this movement, they love his hatred of others.
Oh, yeah.
And it's fear and it is hate, the two strongest emotions that these people gobble up and take into themselves. And that's what is his control.
Yeah, he's got the balls to say the quiet part out loud. He doesn't care, and his base loves him for it. I mean, I was talking with Chris Shelton a few months before the election about this, and he's an ex-Scientologist. We were talking about the cult of Trump and Project 2025, and I said, how does he do it? How does Trump actually do this thing? He's mocking his own advisors because they were saying to him, listen, you've got to stay on policies. Policies is what people want to hear. They want to hear what your policies are. And he would go out and talk about electric boats and sharks and the size of Arnold Palmer's penis. And I mean, they were like flabbergasted by this, but his base was lapping that up. He was mocking his own advisors. Oh, those fools want me to talk about policies, but I'd rather talk about sharks and electric boats and birds getting killed by windmills. And I mean,
and for
and they loved it.
For decades before Trump, these people were so proud to think of themselves as good Christians.
Yeah.
And the love message, the love part of Jesus's message they got. Some of the spiritual warfare and some of the Old Testament approaches is what they've been lapping up now. But Trump had just walked in there when just pure demagoguery.
Yeah.
And it's not as somebody told us when we were writing Holy Terror, the distance between fringe and center is not great. And now the distance between fringe and center has been erased completely.
Yeah. And the guardrails are gone. Well, maybe that's the question. We got to wrap this thing up, and we could talk for hours, I think. But what's the future hold? Because you're sitting there going, okay, you laid the groundwork with Holy Terror and Snapping. And when I read those two books, it put so many pieces together for me, because I lived through a lot of that when I was a kid growing up in church. I was 13 years old, baptized for the second time. I talk about this in my book. My pastor was a big Jerry Falwell fan, moral majority, handing out voters' guides, and hey, you got to vote for these candidates, and you've got to do, and I was thinking it was great. This is wonderful. When I was, the first time I turned 18, I got to vote for Ronald Reagan. I was so proud. I was a Republican straight down the line. I would never think about voting for a Democrat ever, They were ruining the country. And so here I was a part of that whole system you're describing. But what do you see as the future of this thing? Because here's Trump, he's about to take office. What the hell's going to happen? I'm literally afraid. I'm frightened for not just America, but for actually the world when Trump takes office.
Well, I think that Europeans right now, what they're saying, they have it correct. And so do a few people we've heard from here. And that is that in Europe, they realize that what they're looking at is that they no longer have anybody. They are alone. And they have to, and the people here we heard from said the burden and the pressures of keeping the values and principles of a democracy, of a humane society, is going to fall on the Europeans. And that how they fare there is going to have a lot to do with it. But here at home, I think there are two different things. One is people have to care. And I think that was one of the things that was absent in this election. Why millions of Americans didn't vote, and why so many, even Democrats, went to Trump. The absence of care. We've known enough about this man to care about our country, to care about what it is that the United States stands for in the world. They don't care. It doesn't matter anymore. But caring, we've got to care. If we don't care, then Donald Trump can do anything he wants to us. to the American people.
Hmm.
And the second thing is that the evangelicals, especially now, those who have been in different churches and in different programs for a long time, like you were, and it's like coming out and what that's all about. But also people who are in there now, they have to start telling their own stories. You're telling your story. The voices of the evangelicals
And the ex-evangelicals.
and the ex-evangelicals are so important. They're the most important thing in relation to opening up this care and something for our own country so that it doesn't get eaten alive, because the controls that are in place internally in this movement, Donald Trump's MAGA, those controls cannot be broken by anybody around them. They cannot be broken. They can only be broken by people who can go to the heart of the matter, and that is the base of the Republican Party, the base of Donald Trump's people, and that is all of evangelical Christianity and everything about it.
One of the things we've seen from the beginning, nobody knows they're in a cult. They certainly won't admit it, but nobody knows they're under mind control when they're under it. It's only when they come out. Why, for us, 40 years ago, it was the ex-cult members who taught us everything we have learned about mind control, emotional control, information disease. And when we met Diane, the first ex-Christian, and the others in our book, and hundreds since, what we've learned is it's when they come out, when they come to understand. We did this, we began this study with you, with your audience and other evangelical audiences. One thing we learned, I can't go into all the details now, but 90% of the people who responded to our survey said they had doubts while they were in and under evangelical Christianity. And of those 90%, half of them said that they pretended that they didn't. And when we asked them about the long-term effects, the mental, the emotional, the cognitive changes on their minds and their bodies even, we found that those people who pretended that they had no doubts had much longer time to get over all the after effects, to recover, to reach a full state of recovery. And why your group, your audience is so important, because now you've come out, you have stories to tell, you have hard-won wisdom to share, and it's your voices may be the only ones who will be able to get to the Republican base that has held firm through 40 years and is now in its deepest state of control and conditioning.
That's so true. I like what you were saying earlier. I mean, basically, Donald Trump has taken over the Republican Party. It's his party now, and they are doing his bidding because his base is so powerful. I mean, we saw this, guys like Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz and people like that who vehemently opposed Donald Trump when he was running for president the first time. And they did a complete 180 when they realized, my God, he's going to become the president. Oh my God, he is the president. And I'm afraid of his base. He's got so much power. He could destroy me. And they just switched 180 degrees. There's been so many Republicans, and the ones who did speak up, like Liz Cheney and was it Adam Kinzinger, they're gone. They either resigned or got pushed out.
Yes.
So that's what happens when you speak up. Yeah.
The collapse of courage and political leadership under Donald Trump has been near total. It was in his first term, and now we're going to see very quickly, and I'm not optimistic that anyone will defy him out of his control. As Woodward's book said, it was fear. Trump said that's how he controls, through fear, but he controls through the internalization of the loyalty oaths that he exacts on all who surround him.
Right.
Yeah, we know Trump
one of
is...
the things I know.
Well, go ahead. What were we going to say?
Well, I was just going to close up.
Yeah, go ahead. You get the final word then.
I get the final word.
Yeah.
One of the things that from our original study of the cult phenomenon and the effects of the long-term effects of cult control, that we won a National Mental Health Award for that study. And one of the questions, the only open-ended question we asked people, was at the very end of the questionnaire, and we asked them about how their feelings coming out and how it was, whatever. And for all of the people we addressed in the cult phenomenon, in the Occult Awareness Network, and we were the major keynote speakers in their final big conference. And there was one response that we carried with us. I'll just read this. There's one response we carried around the country and shared with all kinds of audiences, a poem. We don't know for sure who wrote it. Just the initials PMK. We bring it home now. If you're out there anywhere, we'd love to meet you. We leave you not with any more of our words, but with some of yours. Some by PMK. And this is an untitled poem. So you struggle with the sorrow of the time which they have borrowed, and you wonder how they ever took your mind. But it's my heart that had been taken, and all the dreams that I'd been making were the luring and prophetic hopes sublime. Now I wander through uncertainty and emptiness called liberty, not knowing what to grasp or what to shun. Good and right within myself throw countless pages back upon the shelf. No easy answers, but it seems a new life has begun. So many choices, like a million inner voices. Once again, a new life has begun. PMK.
We need to find out who this. That's a great poem, isn't it? I can
Why
definitely
we know
resonate with that.
you, Clint, and your audience are potentially some of the most important people wherever
Right
you
now.
are to get through to the Republican base, the MAGA fundamentalist base that has been the core of this movement for 40 years.
Let's
And
hope
it's not
so.
going to be easy. The next few years, we are not optimists. I think it's
No.
going to be darker than anyone ever anticipated. And Trump's ability to wear down, tear down is unlimited. And everyone else has, with normal human emotions, has got a limited amount of adaptability, of hope, of energy. And the challenge now is going to see who is going to be able to stand up to this, to resist, and try to keep America alive.
Things there are no guardrails now, or very, very few.
No.
And the thing about it is, Trump is in total control. And what's different this time, it's not going to be like his first shambolic presidency. I mean, I don't think he honestly expected to win the first time. He was shocked. He was absolutely unprepared. And obviously, he didn't know who to appoint. He fired a lot of people. Anyone who pushed back against him. This time, it ain't going to be like that at all. That was a practice run the first 4 years. Now he's got sycophants, loyalists. He's got Heritage Foundation, Project 2025, America First Policy Institute. They are ready to go on day one. There's an army of trained people ready to go. They've been trained by Heritage, Project 2025, hundreds, thousands of people. So this is not going to be like his first presidency on any level.
And from the White House, the executive branch, to Congress, to the Supreme Court, they have all made clear their intentions to tear down the foundations of American society and its institutions and the wall of separation between church and state, brick by brick.
And just like the church behind you.
That's what's going on outside our window.
Yeah.
And I'm
It's
afraid
a fitting
that's
metaphor.
going on.
All right, well, we need to go, but this is my question then. How can people get a hold of the classic edition of Holy Terror? Where is it available? And how can people get a hold of you two if they want to get more information on Holy Terror and snapping? I know a lot of the books are out of print now. I found mine on eBay or something like that, or Amazon. It was out of print, but I found a copy of it years ago.
Oh, Snapping and now Holy Terror are both back in print. They're
good.
Available on Amazon and at bookstores everywhere, as they say, from Still Point Press. The second edition of Snapping and the classic edition of Holy Terror. And you can reach us through stillpointpress.net. Go contact Flo and Jim at stillpointpress.net. And we're here, and we encourage everyone to speak out and reach out, not just to us, but to everyone around you, because without that, the voices will fall silent and there'll be no one to help these people who have tumbled down the holes.
And as we've learned in 40 years of research and investigation and analysis and all of it, from the cult phenomenon to now is that the people who have gone through this, the people who have gone through it, are the ones who understand. And they are the ones who understand even some of our lingo. Like I told the cult awareness network, you probably stub your toes on some of our concepts that we have put in to say what this is that happened to you. And I think that why they're so important is because with their understanding, they are the ones who can educate people, more than we can. They are the ones.
That's you, Clint, and why we applaud you and support all your efforts and your audience and the many, many evangelicals who are out there all over. You don't know what a resource you are and how valuable you can be, and we can't think of another group that has the potential to get through these people, to these people, as we say, whose minds have been snapped shut with absolute answers.
Yeah. We might save the world. That's the thing. I don't think people realize that, but yeah, an ex cult member, ex Christian, ex religious person, that's one of the most difficult paths to navigate. It's so hard to walk away from a complete belief system, like your worldview, everything that made sense to you, to jettison all of that and embrace a whole new life. Like your poem said, all these choices out there, man, that's powerful, but it's so hard to do.
And the other reason that you're all so important is because what we are looking at now is a new form of control. A new form of control. When I talk about internalized control, things that you hear, words, repetitions that go in and control your behavior, control what you think, control what you say. And those controls, I can tell you, nobody is ready to understand that, not in the highest branches of anything, anywhere, except these people. You did. The ex-cult members have. These evangelicals are the ones who can understand this new form of control.
As we said in the first page of Holy Terror, this was a crusade to pierce the heart of America without bloodshed. And unfortunately, now even bloodshed is no longer off the table.
Exactly.
Anything can happen in the years ahead, and very likely will. And the strength and courage it takes for you, Clint, for your audience, to take the journey that you have taken and come out the other side whole and intact. And as we've seen, a lot of people are still struggling years later from the effects of their experiences inside these demanding, controlling churches and other political movements. But this strength is what you have to offer, proof that you can come out of this, and maybe America will one day too.
And if there's anything, everybody would say to us when we were researching the cults, and everybody would say to us when we were researching Holy Terror, everybody's looking for a larger purpose, a larger meaning that they wanted to be part of. Well, guess what? In an information age, one of the biggest meanings and biggest purpose you can be a part of is learning and understanding and loving our humanity and loving human beings as they are, with the beautiful capacities they have that are being taken and controlled and used against them. So that's the larger purpose in the 21st century.
That's a larger purpose. I'm so glad we've gotten this chance to reconnect. I was going to say to the listeners, if you hear banging and pounding throughout this podcast, that's Flo banging on the desk every time she makes a point. So I love your passion, but it does come through the mic. You do realize that.
I try to grab her hand, but Flo
you just get into it.
I call her
so much.
My esteemed colleague.
It's all part of the passion that comes through. But I was going to say, we cannot wait another 2-3 years to meet up again, especially with the cult of Trump and what's going to happen. So please, let's do another podcast sometime next year, and then we'll have a catch up on what we talked about today. But thank you so much, Flo and Jim. We will see you soon, I'm sure. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule.
Thank you, Clint. We've been tracking this for 40 years, and we're going to stay on it.
We'll stay on it. And maybe we'll do one from Greece.
That's right. I was going to say, the next time you're in Greece, I'll come down and visit you. We'll have a really good chat in person. We'll finally meet up, and that'll be a wonderful little, catch up time. So I'm looking forward to hopefully meeting in person someday.
Great, Clint. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all your listeners.